Decision-making. Background. Northwestern crows display an elaborate sequence of behaviors as they forage for shelled mollusks on the Canadian west coast. First, birds land on intertidal beaches that are littered with whelks. They walk across these sandy flats, testing whelks one at a time by picking them up in their beak and then dropping them back on the ground. After several tests, birds select the largest whelk and fly with it above the nearby rocks. When they reach a certain height, birds drop the whelk and watch to see if it breaks. If it does, they receive the tasty inner morsels. If not, they pick it up again and repeat the process until they are successful in obtaining the food. Observing this behavior, Zach, 1979, wondered why particular whelks were selected, how crows determined when to drop them, and whether they would abandon a particular whelk that did not break after repeated drops. To answer these questions, he set up his own test site with a rope and pulley that allowed him to drop whelks of different sizes from different heights. Not surprisingly, the higher the drop, the more likely the break, with larger whelks breaking more easily than smaller or medium-sized ones. Bigger shellfish provide more calories, so it seemed intuitive that crows would select the largest whelks and then drop these from the highest possible height. The problem with this strategy is that carrying larger loads requires more energy, and flying upwards becomes increasingly costly in terms of metabolic resources. Zach also observed that whelks dropped from greater heights were more likely to bounce or shatter, making it difficult to retrieve and consume them. Taking these factors into account, Zach determined that a crow's best strategy was to select the largest whelk and drop it from a height of approximately 5 meters, almost exactly what the crows were doing. He also concluded that repeated droppings did not increase the probability of a shell breaking, so even if a particular whelk did not break after a certain number of drops, there was no advantage to abandoning it for a different one. This is particularly true as it would take more time and energy to go back to the beach and select another whelk, rather than retrieving the one that did not break. In line with this reasoning, crows continued to drop the same whelk until it broke or was lost. Chapter Plan. Foraging by northwestern crows appears to involve complex calculations of the costs and benefits associated with selecting and then dropping each whelk. There is no evidence that birds are aware of these mental computations, or that they begin each foraging bout with an understanding of how it will proceed, i.e., from searching to dropping to eating. The most likely explanation for this particular pattern of behavior is that cognitive processes guiding each step in the sequence were shaped by natural selection. The first section of this chapter develops this idea in detail, providing evidence that many species forage in a way that optimizes the return on their behavior. The same is true of other behaviors that involve a choice, such as habitat or mate selection. Even large groups of animals sometimes coordinate their behavior in a way that minimizes costs and maximizes benefits for the group. Taken together, these examples provide evidence that decision-making, at least in these naturalistic examples, is guided by evolutionary pressures. The chapter is not concerned with the particular choices that organisms make, e.g., which food, habitat, or mate to select, but with the processes that determine how these are made. This is examined in the second section of the chapter by reviewing experiments in which individuals select among various behavioral options. At least under certain conditions, humans and animals allocate their time and resources such that payoffs for these behavioral choices are maximized in the long term. This line of research developed into the field of behavioral economics, in which decision-making is described in terms of economic principles. These explain, at least partially, how humans and animals make choices between different types of reinforcers that are available simultaneously. The chapter also covers mechanisms of choice behavior when outcomes are uncertain, particularly when risk is involved. Given these unknowns, many organisms rely on general-purpose cognitive strategies to make decisions. Although these often lead to the best choice, however that is defined, there are many examples of maladaptive decision-making when animals or humans revert to these cognitive rules of thumb, mental heuristics. On the other hand, When decision-making is examined within an ecological framework using more naturalistic experiments, many of these seemingly poor choices can be reinterpreted as providing fitness advantages to both the individual and its species. Contrary to popular belief and to most philosophical writing, at least from the past, emotions may facilitate, rather than disrupt, effective decision-making. Evidence for this position is derived primarily from brain-damaged patients, although the idea fits with evolutionary perspectives on cognition. The final section of the chapter describes the brain systems that mediate the interaction between emotions and decision-making, with a focus on understanding how connections between the cortex and striatum in mammals code for different aspects of choice behavior. Comparable mechanisms have yet to be identified in non-mammalian species, although there is no doubt that these also involve physiological computations of fitness-related costs and benefits. Evolution of decision-making. The pattern of behavior displayed by northwestern crows in the chapter opening provides evidence for decision-making, the cognitive process of selecting one course of action over a variety of options. Choice is the outcome of that process, a motor action or verbal response that indicates selection of an option. The idea that decision-making is an inherited trait shaped by natural selection seems to imply that organisms have no control over their own choices. This raises the question of whether humans and animals possess free will, a topic that has been debated for centuries. See Box 7.1. Box 7.1. Free will. Humans have an unwavering belief that their actions are volitional, even if they acknowledge that some behaviors occur unconsciously. Indeed, faith in this principle is so strong that restrictions on freedom of choice in most cultures are considered to be a violation of human rights, as long as the subsequent behavior does not harm other individuals or society. Despite this belief, or perhaps because of it, the debate concerning free will, including whether it exists at all, is ongoing. Aristotle was probably the first philosophers who argue that decision-making, at least in some instances, is guided by forces that originate within the individual, i.e. volition. In the 13th century, the 1200s, Thomas Aquinas formalized the idea into a doctrine of human action, which stated that God is the first cause of any decision, but from there voluntary action may emerge. The debate is not limited to Western thinkers. Hindu, Buddhist, and Islamic philosophers have all queried both freedom of thought and freedom of action, particularly how these can be reconciled with unconscious acts. In contemporary writing, the philosopher Daniel Dennett argues that free will must exist, even if it cannot be identified, because some individuals behave in a way that is unpredictable. The main problem with these philosophical theories of free will is that they almost always invoke some metaphysical component, which makes it difficult to verify that free will exists. Even those who believe in the concept, such as William James, acknowledge that there is no evidence to support it. In the last 30 to 40 years, scientists have proposed methods to study free will using brain imaging technology. If anything, these data challenge the existence of free will. For example, Libet and colleagues, 1983, demonstrated that brain activity related to behavioral choice occurs prior to conscious awareness of the choice. Although these early studies were criticized on methodological grounds, more sophisticated measures of brain activity confirmed the basic finding. Scientists were able to predict which of two buttons subjects would press up to 10 seconds before they were aware of making this choice. Moreover, they could manipulate which hand an individual would use in a motor task by temporarily inactivating a portion of the frontal cortex. Subjects reported that they had selected the hand to move, suggesting that a conscious self does not initiate an action, but is informed later of behavior that the rest of the brain and body are planning. Many people are uncomfortable with these findings because they appear to reduce humans to mindless automata that respond predictably to environmental signals, but this is probably an exaggeration. Even invertebrates behave in ways that do not depend entirely on external stimulus. Moreover, When animals are trained in simple conditioning tasks, not all animals behave the same way, and not every animal behaves the same on every trial. These individual differences in behavioral responses may be adaptive in that predictability is seldom advantageous for predators or for prey. Animals must balance effectiveness and efficacy of responding with just enough variability to make their behavior appear random. Perhaps this flexibility in responding is a manifestation of an evolutionary strategy to introduce variability into behavioral choice. Free will could reflect conscious awareness of this flexibility. Regardless of how it is defined, the debate surrounding free will is unlikely to decline soon, as it has important implications for individual and legal responsibility. Most importantly, belief in free will gives people a sense of agency, which is an important determinant of life fulfillment. Optimal foraging theory. The idea that decision-making evolved to maximize fitness is often examined in terms of foraging behaviors. The amount of energy acquired during food consumption is offset by the energy expended to obtain it. Optimal foraging theory formalizes this idea by stating that organisms forage in a way that maximizes net energy gain per unit time. This principle was demonstrated in a study examining seed gathering by eastern chipmunks. Chipmunks are central place foragers, meaning that they carry food back to a home base, e.g. a nest or burrow, where it is consumed or stored for later use. In the case of chipmunks, seeds are carried in their cheeks, which conveniently expand, and the further the seeds need to be transported, the more seeds the chipmunks carry on each journey. See Figure 7.1a. Humans exhibit a similar behavior when they drop by a corner store to pick up one or two items, but reserve long drives to a supermarket for large shopping expeditions. At least for animals, transport becomes increasingly difficult with heavier loads. As with many animals, common starlings modify their foraging behavior to account for this factor. First, they probe the grass with their beaks to uncover larvae of leather jackets. Then, they pick up these worm-like maggots to carry back to the nest. As their beak fills up, it becomes harder to find and pick up the next prey. As shown in Figure 7.1b, the bird's choice of how many leather jackets to carry back to the nest took into account the diminishing returns of larger loads. As predicted, these decisions maximized prey delivery to offspring per unit time. Figure 7.1. A. An eastern chipmunk stuffs its cheeks full of seeds to carry back to the nest. So cute. B. The relationship between load size and travel time in starlings. Birds were trained to retrieve worms from a feeder that was located at increasing distances from their nest. The number of worms carried on each trip increased with longer travel times between the two locations. So on the y-axis of this scatter plot is number of worms carried per trip from 0 to 7, and on the x-axis is total travel time in seconds from 0 to 100 seconds. Wow, so really, yeah, it's not quite a linear relationship, but it definitely goes up. That the longer the travel time, the number of worms carried per trip does increase. Extensions of optimal foraging theory considered factors other than travel time that may impact net energy gain during foraging. One of the most important is handling, the time and energy required to extract a consumable food item from its source. This could include breaking a shell, sucking nectar from a flower, hulling seeds, or ripping open a carcass. Shore crabs, feeding on blue mussels, exhibit handling as they break the mussel outer shell to gain access to the inner flesh. The quantity of flesh extracted per handling time is maximized with intermediate-sized mussels, exactly those that are selected most frequently by crabs. These data support the optimal foraging theory, but they do not fit the model perfectly. For example, when crabs were foraging in environments with an overabundance of large mussels, they consumed more intermediate-sized prey than expected, given that it took more time to find these than the readily available large mussels. This rate of encounter was taken into account in a study of great tits feeding on mealworm beetles of different sizes, Again, the general findings supported optimal foraging theory, but choice behavior was not predicted perfectly by net energy gain per unit time. More specifically, when the relative abundance of small mealworms increased, birds did not select these more frequently. Krebs and colleagues proposed that some of these deviations from optimal foraging could reflect constraints on other cognitive processes. For example, animals may make errors when discriminating large from small prey, or they may not remember the handling time of different types of prey. This would lead to less than optimal foraging, even if decision-making was still intact. Decision-making during foraging may also be affected by factors not directly related to feeding, particularly predation. Many animals are in a vulnerable position when they leave the relative security of a home base to search for food. This explains why leafcutter ants forage primarily during the night when they are less likely to be attacked by parasitic flies. A similar effect was observed in common garden skinks, living in different environments. When these small reptiles were reared in enclosures that contained the scent of a predatory snake, they foraged at lower rates and grew more slowly than skinks reared in an environment without this scent. Foraging bouts by rats are also inhibited if predators are detected. All of these findings emphasize that optimal foraging is compromised under conditions of high predation. Although it is seldom tested directly, a fundamental assumption of optimal foraging theory is that net energy gain is associated with fitness. That is, in order for foraging efficiency to be favored during natural selection, it must be associated with higher reproductive success. This appears to be the case with captive zebra finches working for their daily ration of food. In this study, the energy required to obtain the food was manipulated by increasing the amount of time required to search for the food. As expected, reproductive success over the bird's lifetime was positively correlated with net calorie gain per day and not with the total amount of food consumed. The relationship between optimal foraging and long-term fitness needs to be examined in other species under both laboratory and natural environment conditions. Marginal value theorem. A premise of optimal foraging theory is that food is distributed evenly throughout an environment. This is seldom the case. More commonly, consumable resources aggregate in patches, discrete areas within a habitat that contain food, separated by areas with little or no food. As animals forage in one patch, resources are depleted, so the fitness benefits of staying in this one location decline over time. The marginal value of a patch is the point at which the net energy gain from foraging is lower than the average energy gain of the surrounding habitat. Marginal value theorem predicts that animals will move to a new patch when foraging if the current patch declines below the marginal value. This idea fits an optimization model in that choice behavior, whether to move, is determined by the best payoff, staying in one patch versus moving to another. Figure 7.2 shows that the decision to move to a new patch is determined both by the amount of resources in the current patch and by the distance between patches. In this experiment, great tits foraged for worms that were hidden in plastic cups filled with sand. The cups were set up at different locations, i.e. patches, in an aviary, and were filled with different amounts of mealworms. In line with the marginal value theorem, birds spent more time in patches that had a greater number of worms and stayed longer when the next patch was further away. Figure 7.2. Decision-making according to the marginal value theorem in great tits. Birds were trained to forage for worms placed in plastic cups filled with sand, patches, throughout an aviary. The number of worms in each patch varied, as did the distance between the patches. As the travel time between patches increased, birds spent more time foraging at individual patches. So the y-axis of this scatter plot is time in patch, or patches, from 0 to 96 seconds, and the x-axis is the travel time in seconds. So as the travel time between patches increases, they do spend longer in a specific patch. The idea that animals choose to move to a new patch as resources decline suggests that they have some knowledge of the foraging payoff in different patches. Lima, 1984, examined how this occurs in downy woodpeckers by setting up 3 separate habitats containing empty logs that were filled with a different number of prey items. Birds accessed these by pecking through masking tape that covered 24 holes in each log. Each habitat had poor and rich patches, empty logs or those with food. Rich patch logs in the first habitat had 24 prey items, those in the second had 12, and those in the third had 6. Woodpeckers had several days to sample each habitat, and the question of interest was how quickly they would desert the poor patches, i.e. empty logs, when the payoff of foraging in rich patches varied. As shown in Figure 7.3, birds developed a different strategy in each habitat. In the first, they quickly abandoned a log with empty holes, appearing to reflect knowledge that these poor patches did not contain any prey. As the value of rich resource logs decreased, i.e. from 24 to 12 to 6, birds sampled more holes in the empty logs before moving to the next patch. This suggested that the choice to move to a new patch was dictated by knowledge of patch payoffs within a habitat. Figure 7.3. Foraging patterns of downy woodpeckers match predictions of the marginal value theorem. Birds had access to 3 habitats, each containing patches of poor and rich payoff, logs that were empty or filled with prey items. The number of logs filled with prey in the rich patches varied from full to half full to 1/4 full. A. The average number of holes that birds opened in full and empty patches for each day of the study. No data, ND, were collected on day 12. Horizontal lines indicate the time during which each environment was available and represent the predicted number of holes that birds should sample in the poor patches before giving up on a patch as empty. B. The frequency distribution of the number of holes sampled before giving up on a patch as empty in each of the 3 habitats. Arrows indicate the predicted optimal number of holes a bird should sample according to the marginal value theorem. Okay, so in A, you can see on the y-axis is the average number of holes opened from 0 to 22, and on the x-axis is day from 1 to 31. So it went on for a month every day. So you can see that the number of holes does seem to correspond to how full the log was of prey. Okay, so this graph is these graphs are very difficult to interpret, but it is kind of looking like, so it says that the label for the graphs are the frequency distribution of the number of holes sampled before giving up on a patch is empty. Okay, and the arrows predicted the optimal number of holes a bird should sample according to the marginal value theorem. So then when you see that there is a full patch, the birds only need to sample 1 hole to figure out that it has become empty. If it's half full, the birds sample 3 holes to figure out if the log has become empty. And when the log is 1/4 full, the birds sample 6 holes to figure out if the log has become empty. And now these arrows the predicted values do correspond quite closely. It is the mean for 2 out of the 3 graphs, and it's right next to the mean for the other graph. So it looks like the birds are optimizing their strategy according to the marginal value theorem.